Now we're going to talk about the parent-child relationship. So first off, let's define attachment parenting. You know about attachment now. So in the 1920s, John Watson, our favorite behaviorist, advocated strictness in child rearing, even saying there was danger in parents expressing love to their children. He said to simply pat them on the head or give them a firm handshake. It was the parents' words of approval and disapproval that were the most important. Does that sound right to you? Well, around the mid-century, like 1960s, Dr. Spock advocated a balanced approach between love and discipline. And he had books everywhere. He was very popular at the time. You can find parenting books that argue for every possible approach, some advocating what could be considered abuse, and others saying to avoid discipline altogether. So it's really hard for parents to know what to do. So what I'm going to teach you is the research-based best practices. So today's guiding theory of parenting is attachment parenting. It's based on the research of John Bowlby and his successors. Unlike many other parenting styles, it is supported by a continually growing body of scientific evidence, studies that use the scientific method, and empirical data. So you can read about these in journal articles. And many of these are longitudinal studies. They've been done over the course of years or even decades. So the traits of attachment parenting are as follows. Consistency. This means acting the same toward children at all times. Rules stay the same regardless of circumstances, as do the consequences. You don't let them get away with something one day and then punish them for it the next. You need to be consistent. Second is communication. This is the number of words spoken in a positive tone. Yelling at your children or lecturing them or scolding them does not count as communication. Communication means listening as well as talking. And third is constraints. Set limits, even for toddlers. Help children find the limits of their power rather than giving in to their demands. And be sure you do set limits for them. Just make sure those limits are developmentally appropriate. You wouldn't set the same limits for a toddler as you would for a teenager. So, some traits of good parents. What do good parents look like? Well, they assume responsibility for their own lives. They sacrifice, and by that I mean they give up some of their own interests for that of their children. They give up some of their time, the things they might like to do. They do sacrifice something for their children, but not everything. They provide limits, so they give their children rules and things they can and cannot do. They want their children to be responsible, self-sufficient, and ethical. That's their goal. They also realize they can't always protect their children from all of life's hurts and difficult times. You can't keep your children in a bubble and keep them safe from everything. Sometimes you have to let them do things on their own and get hurt. That's how they learn. Good parents teach values. Values such as delayed gratification, how to deal with frustration, and the value of work. This could also be the cultural values or your religious values, but you teach those to your children. And most importantly, give love and support. We need to give love and support to our children while they go through all of their developmental stages. Even if you don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, still love and support them. So what do children need? These are the needs of children based on research. They need an attachment bond. This can lead to parental self-confidence long before the child can speak. So what that means is that if a parent has a good bond with their baby, they feel better of themselves as parents, and they're more likely to be good parents if they have that confidence. Children need physical expressions of love. From birth onward, they need to be touched and hugged and kissed. They need physical expressions of love. These expressions might diminish in openness and frequency as they become awkward and or embarrassing for older children. You don't want to force teenagers to give you hugs and kisses if they don't want it. But children do need touch. Two-way communication. They need to be heard, not just talked to. They need to feel heard. They do need constraints. Children who aren't given any sort of constraints do not have good outcomes. They need to have their accomplishments acknowledged, so when they do something well, They need someone to praise them for it. And these should be realistic accomplishments. And you should never give them unearned praise. We'll talk more about that later. But when they do something well, even if it's something simple, like they put their plate in the dishwasher after dinner without you having to tell them, they like to have those acknowledged. Or if it's a big accomplishment, such as getting straight A's at school, acknowledge those things, praise them for those things. Children need to be treated as individuals. They should not be treated as a possession or as an extension of the parent. They are their own person, and they get their individual interests encouraged and supported. They need parents with balance. Parents who balance their own adult relationships and interests with a lifestyle that is conducive to child rearing. That goes back to that good parent sacrifice. But parents shouldn't sacrifice everything for their children. There needs to be a balance between the parent's needs and the child's needs so that everybody is happy. And finally, if you want your children to turn out well, spend twice as much time with them and half as much money. Kids need time with their parents. They don't need more toys. Give them a few good toys, not a lot of cheap toys. Don't spend a ton of money on them. They don't care. They won't grow up and remember that, but they will remember the time you spent with them. Amount of time is far more important than the amount of money. Normally I would take you through an exercise, but since we're online, we don't get a chance to do this, so I just want you to take a minute to think about this. So maybe pause the video for a few minutes and just think about it. So list the qualities of a bad supervisor or teacher. You've all had them. You've all had a bad boss that you hate or a teacher you don't like. So I want you to stop for a minute or two and think about what makes those bosses bad. What made those teachers bad? Now that you're done with that, I want you to list the qualities of a good supervisor or a good teacher. What makes those bosses good? What makes those teachers good? If you have those lists in mind, then this next section will make more sense to you. Now we're going to talk about parenting. What you'll find is that a lot of the traits that make a bad boss are the same traits that make a bad parent. And a lot of the traits that make a good boss are the same traits that make a good parent. So in the 1970s, Diana Baumrind did a correlational study. Remember, correlational is just looking at two things to see how they're related. And she looked at parenting styles and child behavior. She wanted to see how child behavior was related to the way the parents parented. And based on this research, she came up with 4 parenting styles. The first is authoritarian. So authoritarian parents attempt to shape, control, and evaluate the behavior and attitudes of the child in accordance with a set standard of conduct, usually an absolute standard. So what does that mean? That means that the parent's word is law, the parent's word is final. There's no room for negotiation, there's no room for talking back. The parent is the ultimate authority. This usually has punitive discipline, so like spanking is a punitive discipline. And these parents demand conformity. They want their children to fit in with what the parent visualizes for them. And they tend to discourage child autonomy, and they value child dependence. They don't want their children to be independent and do their own thing. They want their children to obey. So these children tend not to argue with their parents, but rather consider what their parent says and does as correct. Parents are the ultimate authority. The second parenting style is authoritative. So authoritative parents attempt to direct the child's activities in a rational, issue-oriented manner. So what does that mean? That means that the parent is strict and sets rules, but is willing to discuss and change those rules. They encourage independent thinking from their children, and they tend to encourage a bi-directional discussion surrounding conflict and share their reasoning behind making decisions. So they don't just say yes or no, they give their reasons for their answer. They're open to hearing the concerns of their child when conformity is not achieved. So when the child doesn't do what the parent wants, they're willing to listen to the child's reason for it. They value autonomous self-will and disciplined conformity, which they encourage through affirmation of the child, limit setting, and setting standards of expected behavior. Their discipline practices include reasoning, power, and shaping through structure and reinforcement. They don't want blind obedience from their children, but they do have realistic and meaningful limits and standards. These practices are the most effective in demonstrating or in developing an instrumental competence characterized by the balance of societal and individual needs and responsibilities. What that means is that they raise children who are good at balancing their own needs with the need of other people. The third parenting style is permissive. Permissive parents attempt to behave in a non-punitive, acceptant, and affirmative manner towards the child's impulses, desires, and actions. What that means is they let their kids get away with everything. Parent places few demands. They see themselves as a resource, but not an authority figure for their children. They see themselves as their child's friend, not an authority figure. They're overindulgent. They give few or no consequences. They allow their children to regulate themselves and encourage child's input in making all the decisions about the rules. Their discipline is very inconsistent. Sometimes they might discipline something, but not always. They don't insist on a specific type of behavior, and they tend to avoid having to be in control. They don't want it. The last is neglectful. These parents provide little or no structure. They are emotionally rejectful of the child's needs. They just aren't involved with their children. So based on this, you can probably guess what the best and worst styles are. Based on Baumrind's research, the best was by far authoritative parenting, and the worst was permissive, or the rejecting, neglectful one. Now, a little caveat here, this is in Western cultures. Different parenting happens in different cultures because they have different cultural values. So Baumrind's parenting styles and results apply to Western cultures, specifically the United States. They may not apply in other countries. So here's a little diagram that helps you see the difference between the parenting styles. And I want you to try to relate these traits to what you thought about when you thought about a good or a bad boss. So here we have responsiveness and warmth. Here we have control and strictness, how many demands they place on their parents or on their children. So you see high demands and high warmth and responsiveness is authoritative. So these are some words associated with authoritative parenting. High demands but low warmth is authoritarian. And these are some words associated with this. Because I said so is really used a lot. High warmth but low control is permissive. And here are some words to describe permissive parents. And low control and low warmth is uninvolved. And here are some words to describe those. Okay. So let's go into more detail of the authoritative style. Well, in this one, they have mutual respect. Parents see their children as individuals. Their relationship is built on mutual respect, not on rewards and punishments. They have good communication. Rules exist, but they have a reason and they are explained. And these parents are good role models for their children. Do as I say, not as I do does not work on children. Remember Bandura, children copy what they see. So it's important for parents to be good role models. So the good behavior from children of authoritative parents comes more from fear of letting the parents down than fear of being punished. And you can see some commonalities between authoritative parenting style and those attachment parenting things that we talked about. So we're going to talk about the child outcomes of these different parenting styles in the next video.